examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. And before we get going, may I ask the court to make sure that we have the proper input?
Okay, which one do you need?
I think it's the Elmo, Your Honor. Thank you.
And Judge, the other thing I'd like to do is present the court with something that we filed this morning. It is a brief on the difference between expert and lay opinion related to the defense saying they wanted to call back Detective Stone to talk about the gun and what you could see through the gun. We've got filed in both cases. I'm just going to give you one. It's the same exact motion filed in both cases, and I'm just giving you a courtesy copy.
Okay. Let me know if I hit the right button here.
Okay.
Is it the podium HDMI? No, which one?
Right here.
That one. Okay. Okay. Okay, I think you got it. You ready?
May we proceed?
Go ahead.
All right. Officer Render, yesterday we were talking about how it is that we know that some of the objects we're handling and presenting here in court are what they appear to be and what they claim to be. Does the Albuquerque Police Department have a process for ensuring chain of custody for evidence items?
After they've been checked into evidence?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
What kind of documentation is kept to make sure that chain of custody is maintained?
It's an electronic log.
Can you describe how that's made?
In the computer program that we use, anytime evidence is checked out or transferred to anybody, it's noted in the system. And each item of evidence, it keeps track of all of that for each individual item.
And are those logs created and maintained by somebody at Albuquerque Police Department?
The evidence unit, yes.
And is it
I didn't hear the answer.
The evidence unit?
Thank you.
is it the ordinary practice of the evidence unit to create and maintain those logs?
Yes.
And are those logs created and maintained by somebody with knowledge of the events? Let me ask it this way. When an entry happens in the log, is it made at or around the time that that piece of evidence is taken out or put back in?
Objection calls for speculation.
In the ordinary,
I'll allow him to ask the question. Go ahead.
in the ordinary course of how these logs are created and maintained, is the entry of when an object is checked into evidence or pulled out of evidence made at or near the time of that event?
Yes.
And is it made by a person with knowledge of that event or from information transmitted by a person with knowledge of that event?
Yes.
Now, we spent a lot of time talking about the two paper envelopes that you have in front of you. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm handing you what's been previously marked for identification purposes. It states Exhibit 53I. What is that?
53 what?
I.
Aye.
Oh, lowercase I, maybe one. I wrote a lowercase I there.
It's the evidence log for the item indicated as P400.
Okay, and what item is indicated in that large envelope that you have in front of you?
P400.
And who brought that to court here today?
Detective today?
Yes.
It was checked out by Detective Jeff Stone.
I'm sorry. The
the actual
log
item.
Yeah, 53I.
I brought that this morning.
Okay. Move the admission of 53I, Your Honor.
All right, Jeff, for several reasons. First of all, as he said, he just brought it to court. We've never seen this document before this morning when counsel was kind enough to give us a copy, or not a copy, but to just show us that earlier, right before we started today, number one. Number two, I don't think there's been any foundation laid for that he is the custodian of records of this. And number three, he does it, it's a hearsay document, so if they want it in, they're going to have to lay the proper foundation for, I think what they're trying to do is a business record, but they haven't done that, Your Honor.
Any response?
I think we have made the business record foundation, Your Honor, which does not necessarily require the records custodian. It could be the records custodian, but it could also be somebody who has knowledge of how these are created. For example, the CADS reports in this case have been introduced through the testimony of officers who are familiar with how they're created. And then as far as the fact that they were only shown today, that's only in response to the defendant's consistent challenge of the testimony of the officers that the chain of custody was maintained appropriately. And so we're just attempting to give the defense the information they seem to be wanting yesterday.
I believe the foundation for a business record exception has been laid. I'll admit 53I over objection.
Now, we talked yesterday about during the processing of officers on scene, their weapons were taken and photographed. In this case, did you take photographs of any weapons?
I did.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm handing you what's been previously marked for identification purposes as State's Exhibit 61. What is that?
It is the photograph of the rifle collected from Dominic Perez.
And who took that picture?
I did.
When you took that picture, you wrote some information on a Post-it note. Why did you do that?
Just to document the case it was associated with, when I took the photograph, what it was I photographed, and my initials indicating that I did take the photograph.
And what did you designate that rifle number as?
F1.
And is that picture that you have there in your hand a fair and accurate depiction of that rifle with the Post-it note identifying it on the day that you took that picture?
Yes.
Move the admission of State 61, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
No objection, Your Honor. 61 will be admitted.
All right, and so now that everyone knows what we're talking about, what is this thing up here?
Objection to the form of the question, what is this thing up here?
What is the thing, what is the large object I'm pointing to with my pen there?
The upper receiver?
Okay, I'm sorry. Is this the rifle that you took a picture of?
Yes.
Okay. I asked that because, of course, no one in the gallery, with the exception of you, was looking at the picture when we were talking about it.
I see.
Okay, and what is this yellow square down there?
That's the Post-it note.
Okay, and what does it say right here?
F1.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Yes, and counsel, you don't need to ask me anymore if you need to approach the witness. Just go ahead and do it.
Sure. All right, thank you, Judge. I'm handing you what's been previously marked for identification purposes as State's Exhibit 62. What is that?
It's a photograph of the rifle collected from Keith Sandy.
Who took that picture?
I did.
And did you follow the same process, including the Post-it note information?
I did.
What did you designate that rifle as?
F2.
And is that picture a fair and accurate depiction of that rifle and that Post-it note as it was when you took that picture that day?
Yes.
Move the admission of State 62, Your Honor.
Any objection, 63?
No objection.
62, Your Honor, I apologize.
I'm sorry, 62. No objection, Your Honor. 62 will be admitted.
Now that it's in, is this the rifle?
It is.
And what is this yellow square down there?
The Post-it note.
And what is that piece of information I'm pointing at with my pen?
F2.
When you're out on scene, were there a lot of objects scattered all about?
Yes.
At some point, did you come across a black bag with a lot of items inside of it?
Yes.
And did you collect that black bag?
I did.
After you collected it, what happened to it?
It's taken back to the crime van, stored in there until we could transport it back to the crime lab.
At some point, were the objects in that black bag and the black bag itself examined?
Yes.
And were you there when that happened?
Yes.
I'm handing you what's been previously marked for identification purposes as State's Exhibit 19C-I. What is in that plastic bag?
The small black bag and all of its contents.
And is that small black bag and all of its contents in the same or substantially same condition as when you had it checked back into evidence, with the exception of the fact that it's now been opened here in court?
It is.
Move the omission of 19C.
Any objection?
Can I see the bag?
Yes.
No objection. Other than, well, let me make a small objection to the relevancy of it, but I know it's coming in, so I object.
Well, I haven't ruled yet.
I object to relevancy.
Okay.
It's not been established how what's in that bag is relevant. Just because it's found at the place, no different than if it was a crime scene in a house. Everything in the house is not relevant.
Your Honor, same objection, relevance. Neither of these officers knew about that black bag at the time they used force against Mr. Boyd, and therefore it can't be relevant in this case.
Your Honor, I can ask one or two questions to address the concern of relevancy.
Well, maybe for an offer of proof, can you tell me how it's relevant? I'm assuming these are the belongings of Mr. Boyd, personal belongings.
Not only that, Your Honor, this bag was the bag that was on Mr. Boyd's shoulder, tucked under his arm, between his arm and his torso at the time he was shot. And that bag and its contents had the quarter-inch hole all the way through, going through them, that this officer saw when they were doing the examination.
In light of your offer of proof to the court, I'll go ahead and admit 19CI over objection.
When you examined this bag and its contents, did you notice anything important to this case?
Yes.
What did you see?
There's a bullet defect in the top of the bag.
When you say bullet defect, what do you mean by that?
There's a hole created by a bullet passing through.
And did it appear to have passed through all the contents of the bag?
It did.
Did you ever find that bullet that passed through the contents of that bag?
It appeared to exit
Exit what?
the opposite end of the bag.
At some point in this case, did you examine the clothing that had been worn by Mr. Boyd at the time he was shot?
Yes.
Other than the obvious bullet holes and blood and things to that effect, did you ever find anything important to your investigation in this case within that clothing?
Yes.
What did you find?
A copper jacket bullet fragment.
And where did you find it?
On the front of one of the T-shirts.
And what did you do with that fragment?
I collected it and tagged it separate from the clothing.
In front of you should be a small plastic envelope that I believe we've designated as State's Exhibit 53C for identification purposes. What's 53C?
Looks like an A.
Is it A? I'm sorry. 53A. It's my bad writing there.
It's the bullet fragment I collected from the shirt.
Is in the same or substantially same condition as when you collected it and tagged it into evidence?
Despite having been open, yes.
Other than the fact that it's been opened, is it in the same?
Yes.
Okay. Move the admission of 53A, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
No objection, Your Honor.
53A will be admitted.
All right. At some point in the night, were you ordered by command elements of the Albuquerque Police Department to provide all the video evidence that you had received at that point to upper chain of command?
Not that night, no.
Okay. When were you asked to do that?
It was later in the week. I believe it was on the 21st.
Okay. When you did that, did you give them the originals or the copies?
I used a copy of all of the original.
Did you collect lapel cameras and taser cameras from the officers being processed?
They were collected, yes.
And the night of the shooting, did Detective Rick Ingram give over his lapel camera?
On that night, it was not collected.
When did he?
I believe it was 2 weeks later.
Just a moment. Would it help you remember the date more accurately if you saw the report that you prepared in this case?
Yes.
I'll get it. Okay, 2 seconds. Got it.
This is our last page.
Let's see what we're showing.
I'd like you to take a look at that page of your report, read it to yourself, and when you're done and you remember the date when Sergeant Ingram, then Acting Sergeant Ingram, turned in his lapel camera in this case, let me know. Do you remember?
Yes.
And when was that?
March 26th.
Approximately how many days after this incident was that he turned in that lapel camera?
Approximately 10.
And when that lapel camera was turned in, what condition was the data on it in?
The card had been formatted.
To your knowledge, were there any videos recovered of this incident from that lapel camera that had been formatted?
From the incident, no.
I'm handing you what's been previously marked for identification purposes as States Exhibit 53A-1. What's that?
The evidence report for the bullet fragment I collected from the T-shirt.
And is that also the same kind of report as the previous chain of custody report admitted into evidence for the bullet envelope there, P400?
It is.
Move the admission of 53A-I, Your Honor.
Same objection as previously lodged, Your Honor, with the previous exhibit of the same character.
Counsel, did you say this is the same as the previous exhibit that was admitted?
It's the same kind of chain of custody report, Your Honor, just for a different exhibit, which is the bullet fragment.
I have the same, he has certainly not laid any foundation for this document whatsoever. I have the same objection.
Lack of foundation, Your Honor.
I tend to agree. I don't think the foundation's been laid, so I'll sustain the objections.
What is 53A-1?
It's the evidence report for CL 400A,
And what is CL 400A?
the copper jacket bullet fragment I collected from the T-shirt.
And like the other chain of custody form, is that form made by a person in Albuquerque Police Department evidence?
Yes.
Is it made at or near the time reflecting the instances where someone checks in or takes out a piece of evidence?
Yes.
And is it the ordinary course of business for the Albuquerque Police Department and the evidence unit to do that?
Yes.
Is it based on the knowledge of the individual checking it in or the knowledge of the individual allowing it to be checked out?
Yes.
Will the admission of 53A-1, Your Honor?
Can I have more diary, Your Honor?
Go ahead.
Can I see the exhibit, officer? Thank you. Just ask some questions. My understanding is this offense is aggravated assault, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and who was this, who was the aggravated, who committed the aggravated assault?
Objection, Your Honor, relevance,
This is the document you're wanting to get in?
but he's talking about it being labeled for aggravated assault. I don't see the relevance of that as part of this being a business record foundation about here, Your Honor.
It needs to be what they're claiming it is. This says
I'll allow you
aggravated.
to proceed with your question. Go ahead.
Thank you. Aggravated assault is the offense name on this item report, is that correct?
It is.
Okay, and so who are you saying committed an aggravated assault?
James Boyd.
Did you enter that information?
It may have been me.
Well,
It's whoever entered the first item
You
of
don't know
evidence
who-
for that case.
okay, so let's look back at this and tell me,
It's for the entire case, not just for that particular item.
so it's the first one of this case is the one that enters all this information on top, is that correct?
Correct.
How do we determine who that is?
He'd have to be with the evidence unit.
So you would agree with these are essential facts, right, that are part of this chain of custody report, correct?
As far as the item of evidence, it's just case
Well,
information.
Right, it's talking about what case this evidence is assigned to, right?
Yes.
Who entered the case information to determine what this evidence was assigned to? Do you know?
It may have been me, I can't remember.
So you don't even know whether or not, who put the general information about what case this is about, what's the offense? It says on top Nathan Render, do you see that?
Yes.
Does that mean that you created this, sir? Or do you know? Or does that just mean that you're the head criminalist on this case?
Objection, compound.
Sustained.
Let me rephrase the question. Why is your name on the top of this?
Because I was the one that tagged this particular item of evidence into evidence.
Who put the rest of this information on the front, on the top half of this document? Do you know?
Like I said, it may have been me, but I can't remember.
Would you also agree with me that there are a number of areas on this document that are not filled in, that are left blank? Like, for example, next to CAD number, there's no number, is there?
There is not.
Next to serial number, there's no serial number, correct?
It's a projectile, there's no serial number.
Next to the caliber, there's no caliber, right?
Again, it's a projectile. That's generally firearm information.
When it comes to the actual chain of custody itself, how many entries did you make as far as this evidence is concerned?
The initial entry.
How many total entries were made on this document?
Quite a few.
Can you count them, please? You made 1 out of the 45 entries, is that correct?
Yes.
You were not present during any of the other entries, is that correct?
Correct.
So you don't have any understanding of any of the other 44 entries that were made on this document, is that correct? You know what it says, but you don't have any understanding of how it was created.
Correct.
I have the same objection, Your Honor, lack of foundation. This officer obviously doesn't have any real substantive knowledge except for one entry in this document, and they're trying to bring it in through him because there's one entry.
Do you have any additional objections, or
We will
that?
join Defendant Sandy's objection, Your Honor.
Okay, any response?
Yes, Your Honor. All of that goes to the weight, not the admissibility of this document. All that's required for a business record is that it's made at or near the time from information transmitted by person with knowledge. It's the ordinary course of the business practice to create that record. Now, as for the fact that multiple people have followed this ordinary business practice in creating what is the long document that we have there, if we have more than 2 people handling an object, the reason that we create these documents is to know who did it, and it's the ordinary course of evidence and the Albuquerque Police Department to create these logs and do that. As for the questions Mr. Bregman has about how do we know that this is all accurate and done properly, that all goes to the weight, not the admissibility, Your Honor.
Counsel, I agree with you in some respect that a lot of the questions go to the weight rather than the admissibility. 53A1 will be admitted over objection under business records exception.
Handing you has been previously marked for identification purposes as 19A1. What is that?
It's a Bible.
And did you see that book out there at the scene that day?
Not specifically at the scene,
Okay.
but going through all of the items that were collected from the scene.
Okay. Was that book in the same or substantially same condition as when you saw it when it had been collected?
Yes.
With the admission of 19A1?
Objection.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the relevance of a book at the scene. They've not even made an offer of proof. I don't know if a bullet went through this book or not. It's not relevant.
Your Honor, same objection, relevance. Neither of the defendant officers knew of this book at the time they used the force they used against Mr. Boyd. In fact, Detective Render has testified that he actually had to go through the items in order to locate that. He couldn't simply observe it when he was there at the scene.
State, what's the relevance of the book?
There's been testimony, Your Honor, about the concern of Officer John McDaniel, the kinds of objects that James Boyd could have been reaching for when he could not see one of his hands. We're offering these books and other tangible pieces of evidence to show that James Boyd had lots of things, the majority of which were not machetes or axes or things to that effect, to rebut the concern and question that when Officer McDaniel approached him, he could have been reaching for a weapon or anything to that effect.
You're alleging these items were where exactly?
These were within James Boyd's tent encampment, Your Honor.
In the backpacks or in the tent?
They were in the tent area, within the bags, within the tent itself.
So we don't know exactly where they were? I'm trying to figure out where. Were they in this bag or these bags that he was allegedly holding at the time and then dropped? Or?
No, from my understanding, Your Honor, they were somewhere in the scene within his tent encampment. Now, as to where they could have been, we're simply offering these as examples of the kinds of objects that could have been in his immediate reach.
Okay, I'm going to find there's no relevance to it at this point and sustain the objections.
Yes, Your Honor. I'm handing you what's been previously marked for identification purposes as states 19C-2.
What's that? It's an empty can of pepper spray and a carrying case.
You ever seen that before?
Yes.
When did you see that?
While processing the scene.
Is it in the same or substantially same condition as when you saw it?
Yes.
Did you ever determine whether there was anything in that can of pepper spray mace?
It was empty.
Move the admission of, is it C2?
Any objections?
No.
No objection, Your Honor.
And you said that was 19C2?
Yes, Your Honor.
That will be admitted?
One moment, Your Honor. I'm handing you what's been marked for identification purposes 19C2.
I didn't didn't hear the numbers.
19D2 and 19D1. What are these objects?
U.S. currency.
Is it the common practice of the Albuquerque Police Department when going through evidence to sort out and put all the currency together?
Yes.
Does that indicate that the currency in those 2 bags is all that was found when evidence processed the scene?
It's after going through everything, that is all the currency we found.
Is that currency in the same or substantially same condition as when you saw it and it was taken into evidence?
Yes.
With the admission of 19D1 and 2, Your Honor.
Objection, relevancy.
Same objection, Your Honor.
Stroll. There's been testimony about essentially the resources of Mr. Boyd, where he could go, why he was camping out there, the possibility of being offered a hotel, and the fact that he had just a few dollars on him, I think, explains his circumstances and why he was out there, Your Honor.
I agree there's some relevance to these items. They will be admitted over objection.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Okay.
Can I see the exhibit, which is 19C2, I think it's the pepper spray? I'm looking at this just by itself. Are you able to tell it it's empty?
Not by looking at it, no.
So nobody out at the scene at the time would know that that's empty until you did some type of test to it?
I believe so.
Okay. And when did you watch the video? I think you mentioned you may have watched some videos in the crime lab van the night through the early morning hours that you were there. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And did you watch that? Well, let me back up for a second. It appears to me that every single bit of evidence that you've described or talked about all has listed aggravated assault. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did you label those evidence tags after you yourself as an Albuquerque police officer viewed the videos?
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance and outside the scope of direct. And ultimate opinion.
Response?
I don't think it's outside the scope of direct. It's about the evidence itself that he's been talking about so far.
I'll allow you to ask the question. Go ahead. Overruled.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Did you label these documents after you had watched the video? You labeled them aggravated assault. Every one of these pieces of evidence that you've closed up, that you tagged into evidence, every one of them has on it aggravated assault, correct?
Objection, compound.
Rephrase the question, please.
Let me start over again. Does each one of those, pieces of evidence have a tag on it?
Yes.
Does each one of those say aggravated assault?
Yes.
And did you label those aggravated assault, did you label those pieces of evidence after you watched the video that night?
Yes.
And you said earlier, I think on voir dire, that the aggravated assault, the perpetrator of the aggravated assault was Mr. Boyd. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you made the determination to label them aggravated assault, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Ultimate issue, asked and answered.
It's not the ultimate issue. I'm asking him who made the determination to label the evidence tags the way they were labeled.
I'll allow that question to be asked and answered.
I did not know.
You do not know whether or not you did it?
I did not label it an aggravated assault.
Who did?
Detective Stone.
Okay. And did he label that? Did he give you the labels to put those on?
The labels themselves I printed out when I tagged them into evidence.
Now, were you, I think in your direct yesterday, you told us that you were on in the area of this whole scene, the foothills area with the crime lab, from the time you were called out until what time?
I can't remember the exact time we left.
I'm not going to ask you for an exact time. Can you give me an approximation then of when, how long you were out there at the scene?
Late morning?
The late morning the next day.
Yes.
And what is your understanding of what time this incident took place?
Late afternoon, evening.
Okay. And specifically, you have a number of pieces of evidence before you. Do you know after, and I take it the only time you had any contact with any of this evidence was when you tagged it into evidence?
Out at the scene, transporting it back to the crime lab and processing it at the crime lab, and then tagging it in, yes.
And then tagging it in. And you've had no further dealings with any of this evidence that's before you since then, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Can I have just a moment?
Yes.
Your Honor, pass the witness.
All right. Counsel?
Your Honor, if I could ask for a moment to set up my laptop at the podium. And Your Honor, if you'd switch it over to the podium, I believe it's designated as the VGA cable at the podium.
All right.
I'm not seeing it come up, Your Honor. I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Thank you. Now, Detective Rinder, well, first of all, good morning.
Morning.
Now, you began working in law enforcement in 2008, correct?
That's when I joined the academy, yes.
Okay. And you became a detective in the APD's criminalistics unit in November of 2012, correct?
Correct.
And what is APD's criminalistics unit?
It's a unit of detectives that does crime scene investigation for major crimes, homicides, officer-involved shootings, suspicious deaths, things like that.
Now, having began working with the criminalistics unit in 2012, at the time of this incident, you've been working with that unit for approximately 2 years, correct?
About a year and a half.
Okay, a year and a half. Now, with regard to the officer-involved shooting of Mr. Boyd, you were the primary criminalistics detective on this case, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, you were the primary criminalistics detective for the major crime scene team, correct?
At the time, yes.
And what is the major crime scene team?
It's part of the criminalistics unit. It's the detectives that do the crime scene investigation.
Okay, and is it fair to say that the major crime scene team is responsible for investigating particularly violent crimes, correct?
Yes.
And during your time as a detective on the major crime scene team, you've had an opportunity to investigate both officer-involved shootings and homicides that just involve 2 civilians, correct?
Yes.
Now, to the best of your ability, when investigating both officer-involved shootings and non-officer-involved shootings, you investigate those in the same manner, correct?
Yes.
There's no difference between your investigation of a non-officer-involved shooting and an officer-involved shooting, correct?
I try not to.
When you say you try not to, why do you say that?
I mean, I try to investigate every scene the same.
Okay. So whether it's non-officer involved or officer involved, you investigate it the same way.
Yes.
Now, you became the primary criminalistics detective in this case due to a rotating on-call schedule, correct?
Correct.
So you weren't assigned by anyone within the department to investigate this case, correct?
Correct.
You weren't assigned to investigate this case by anyone at the city of Albuquerque, correct?
Correct.
It was just that rotating on-call schedule.
Yes.
And you also did not volunteer to investigate this case, correct?
Correct.
Now, as the primary criminalistic detective on this case, you were responsible for overseeing the entire investigation of this case, correct?
As far as the crime scene is concerned, yes.
Okay, so your investigation was limited to the crime scene.
Correct.
Now, the crime scene in this case was located in the foothills of the Sandia Mountains, correct?
Yes.
And it was near the top of Copper. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, as the primary criminalistics detective, one of your jobs is overseeing the collection and identification of evidence, correct?
Yes.
That includes locating where that evidence is, correct?
Yes.
Marking the evidence,
Yes.
photographing the evidence, correct?
Not personally, but having it photographed, yes.
But you oversee people who do photograph that
Oh,
evidence,
yes.
correct? And you also collect the evidence.
Or oversee.
Okay, so you oversee the collection of that evidence.
Yes.
Now, at the scene of the officer-involved shooting, you collected or your crime scene team that you oversaw collected approximately 90 pieces of evidence, correct?
I don't know the exact number, but it was a large amount.
Is it fair to say that it was around 90 pieces?
Could be.
And it wouldn't surprise you to know that 90 pieces of evidence were collected in this case?
No.
Now, as part of this, you mentioned that photographs were taken of the evidence, correct?
Yes.
In fact, 850 photographs were taken in this case. Does that seem fair?
Sure.
And 19 officers were processed for evidence?
There were quite a few.
And they were processed for that evidence near the scene of the crime, correct?
Correct.
They were processed in the crime van that was located at 8112 Piedra Vista, correct?
Yes.
And they were processed within an hour or two of the incident?
I believe so, yes.
Now, in addition to locating that evidence and photographing it and collecting it, you also took a 3D image of the scene in this case, correct?
It's a 3D laser scanner, yes.
And what is a 3D laser scanner?
It's a scanner used to document the scene. Basically, it takes measurements 360 degrees around it from itself to create kind of a 3D image of the scene.
And why do you use that 3D laser scanner?
It's just used to document the scene as we find it and to help create a diagram later.
Okay. Now, you mentioned a diagram. What diagram are you referring to?
In my report, I created a 2D diagram of the scene.
And you use that 3D scene scan to create that diagram?
Yes.
Now, as you mentioned, part of your responsibilities as the primary detective on this case, or primary criminalistics detective, I should say, you were responsible for drafting a criminalistics report, correct?
Yes.
And in that report, you provided a summary of your investigation, correct?
Yes.
That included information you were provided when you arrived at the scene?
Yes.
Correct. A list of the officers who were processed for evidence?
In the summary,
In your report?
in the report, yes.
Okay. And you also included a description of the scene conditions as they were when you arrived?
Yes.
A list of all the evidence that was located and collected?
Yes.
And then you also included a summary of a video, correct?
Yes.
And that was the video that was recovered from the helmet cam Officer Perez was wearing, correct? Now, you mentioned you created diagrams in this case, correct?
Yes.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, you don't need to ask, just go ahead.
I'm handing you what's been marked as Exhibit M for identification purposes, Defendant Perez's Exhibit M. What have I just handed you?
It is the diagram, the overall scene diagram.
And did you create that diagram?
I did.
And does that diagram fairly and accurately depict the diagram you created in this case?
Yes.
Your Honor, I move to admit Defendant Perez's Exhibit M into evidence.
Any objection?
Your Honor, may I ask one question
Sure.
of the witness? Detective Render, was that diagram part of the report that you made in this case?
It is.
Your Honor, we spent all day arguing over whether the contents of this officer's report were admissible in this proceeding. We've just heard descriptions of what's written in the report, now we're trying to offer part of it. I think under the rule of best evidence, we should just move the report.
Respond.
Your Honor, this is nothing, the objection we had was to hearsay grounds. This is simply a diagram that was drawn by Detective Render that really contains no hearsay at all.
May I take a look at it, please, just briefly? I'll go ahead and admit it over objection. That would be M, and I neglected to ask Ms. Reagan if you had any objection to.
No.
Okay. Will be admitted.
Now, if you look at the screen next to you, is that Exhibit M?
Yes.
Now, you created this diagram using satellite images, correct?
This particular one, yes.
Nonetheless, you were present at the scene and had a chance to observe the surroundings and the scene itself, correct?
Correct.
Now, just to orient the court and counsel, the top of this diagram, if you will, is north.
Correct.
To the right is east.
Yes.
The bottom is south.
Yes.
And the left is west, correct?
Correct.
Now, there are two parallel lines on, well, somewhat parallel lines that run through the middle of this diagram, correct?
Yes.
What are those lines? What do they represent?
It was like a dirt pathway, kind of like a dirt road.
Was it more of a road or more of a pathway?
It was wider than just a regular footpath.
Okay. Now there's also a box on the far right side of Exhibit M that's made up of dotted lines, correct?
Correct.
What does that represent?
That was the actual scene.
Now you mentioned that these diagrams are 2D, two-dimensional, correct?
Correct.
What does that mean?
It means there's no representation of height.
Okay. So this diagram, as it's shown here in court, does not represent any kind of elevation change, correct?
Correct.
Is it fair to say that there is a significant elevation change, though, correct?
Correct.
And beginning at 8112 Piedra Vista to the box where the scene was, that's a significant elevation change, correct?
It is an elevation change.
Okay. Now, was this the only diagram you created in this case?
It was not.
Handing Detective Render what's been marked for identification purposes as Defendant Officer Perez's Exhibit N. What have I just handed you, Detective Render?
It's a diagram I created of the actual scene itself.
So you created that diagram also?
I did.
And does that Exhibit N, fairly and accurately represent the diagram you created in this case?
It does.
Your Honor, I move to admit Officer Perez's Exhibit N.
State.
The same objection, Your Honor. Again, it's part of the exact report that the state attempted to introduce into evidence yesterday. Same diagrams. And
I understand you wanted to introduce the entire, with all the writing and other sources from what other people did as well. Is that correct?
We have an excerpt that is essentially the summary of the initial intake, the time summary of the officers being processed in these diagrams, and then the one page discussing Sergeant Ingram bringing in his camera, which was already addressed earlier by this witness's testimony. That's the entirety of the excerpts. Essentially, the defense has talked about all of the things that are in the exhibit the state attempted to introduce into evidence without actually moving into evidence. And under best evidence, the court should consider the actual evidence, not have the witness talk about what the evidence is.
Any response?
Your Honor, the exhibit that the state attempted to move in was Detective Render's entire report, which is entirely hearsay. An example is a summary of the briefing that occurred. a description of all the evidence that was processed, and these are, it's an extensive report, which is all hearsay, which the court ruled on yesterday that it simply was not admissible because it did not meet an exception. Once again, this is just a diagram that he drew which contains no hearsay, and this is the last thing we'll be moving into evidence that came from his report, but this is not hearsay, which was the issue and our objection to the state's attempt to move his entire report into evidence, which the court noted the rules of evidence don't allow police reports to come into evidence because they are hearsay.
Well, you would agree with me, though, that this diagram is an assertion in and of itself, is it not?
Your Honor, it's him using the 3D image he took of the scene, just simply drawing that out and creating a depiction of the scene.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Anything else, Mr. Holmes?
Yes, Your Honor. Detective Render's report was over 120 pages. The state attempted to introduce into evidence 14 pages yesterday, Your Honor. It's not the entire report. It contains the summary of the initial briefing they received, the timelines for the processing of the officers, the timelines and description of the processing of the scene, and the very diagrams the defense is attempting to move into evidence today.
Why don't you all approach for just a second and bring that statement.
Let me look.
Now, Detective Render, I'm going to pull up in on the screen right next to you as I did with the other exhibit. Now, is it fair to say that this is a diagram of the scene itself, correct?
Correct.
And it is essentially, this is what was in that dotted line box in the other diagram, right?
Correct.
Now, I'd like to talk to you about a few different aspects of this diagram in order to orient the judge and counsel. Now, there are several letters and numbers contained in this diagram, correct?
Correct.
And C in this diagram stands for casing.
Correct.
And that represents casings from both lethal and non-lethal ammunition, correct?
Correct.
And what is a casing from non-lethal ammunition?
I mean, depending on the ammunition, the ones we collected were holes from beanbag munitions and taser shotgun.
So those holes from beanbag ammunition and taser ammunition were located at the scene, correct?
Correct.
Now the letters CL stand for clothing,
Correct.
F stands for firearm,
Correct.
and as you discussed in your direct examination, I stands for impacts,
Correct.
M stands for miscellaneous,
Correct.
P stands for projectile,
Correct.
and P represents, as with C in a similar way, P represents both lethal and non-lethal projectiles, correct?
Correct.
Now 4 projectiles were located at the scene,
Correct.
and all 4 were non-lethal, correct?
Correct.
In fact, there were 3 beanbags located,
Correct.
and 1 X-rep, correct?
Correct.
And what is an X-rep?
It's a munition fired from the taser shotgun.
Okay. Now I also notice a K on this diagram. Now what does K stand for?
Knife.
And how many Ks are on this diagram?
3.
So 3 knives were located at the scene.
Correct.
And during your investigation, were you able to determine who those knives belonged to?
Yes.
And who did the knives belong to?
James Boyd.
Now I'd like to talk to you about those individual knives that you located. Now, as you mentioned before, you had a chance to review the video of this tape, correct? Well, or of the incident, correct?
Correct.
And you drafted, well, scratch that. And as a result of that, of your review of that video, you were able to determine things about the evidence in this case. It helped you investigate, correct?
Correct.
Now, using Exhibit N, can you please identify, and you can actually touch the screen that's next to you, can you please identify where K2 and K3 are located?
That one's a little off.
Okay.
But,
And you can circle them too, you don't just have to touch it.
oh, look at that.
Okay. And during your investigation, you determined that those were the 2 knives that James Boyd had at the time he was shot, correct?
Correct.
Now, I'd like to show you what's previously been admitted as defendants, and you can, let me see, you can clear it by tapping the lower left corner. I want to show you what's been previously admitted as Defendant Perez's Exhibit E1. Now, what's that a picture of?
The knife indicated as K2.
And does that fairly and accurately represent it as it was found at the scene?
It does.
Now I'm going to, and were these knives brought to the evidence lab?
The crime lab, yes.
I'm going to hand you a photograph. It's marked as Defendant Perez's Exhibit E6 for identification purposes. What does that exhibit show?
The knife indicated as K2.
Okay, and does that fairly and accurately depict the knife that was photographed at the evidence lab?
It does.
Your Honor, I move to admit Defendant Perez's Exhibit E6.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
No objection.
E6 will be admitted.
Now I'm going to bring that up on the screen next to you. Now on this knife, which was marked as Exhibit K2, there is a small metal knob protruding from the blade, correct?
Correct.
And if you know, what is that knob used for?
Opening the knife from its folded position.
And how would you do that? If I give you a knife, can you demonstrate how that's done?
Sure.
And this is a fake knife, no blade on it. Can you demonstrate how that knob would be used to open the knife?
Put your thumb on it. Push it open.
So what you've just done is used one hand, your right hand, to open the knife, correct?
Correct.
So using that small knob, you can open a knife with one hand. Is
Correct.
that correct? Now, I'm also going to show you what's been admitted as Defendant Perez's Exhibit E2. Now, on this, is it fair to say that this is the same knife just flipped over?
It is.
And I see a large metal piece on the side of that knife, correct?
Correct.
And what is that piece of metal used for?
Clipping it on to a pocket, a belt, clipping it anywhere to hold it.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that in addition to K2, you also found another knife, and you marked that, or someone in your team marked that as K3, correct?
Correct.
I'm going to show you it's been previously admitted as Defendant Perez's Exhibit 3, or Exhibit E3, I'm sorry. Now, is that a fair depiction of exhibit, or the knife that was marked as K3 at the scene?
Yes.
And that's where it was located by the criminalistics team?
Correct.
And was that knife also taken to the evidence lab?
Yes.
I'm going to hand you what's been marked as Exhibit E8 for identification purposes. What does that exhibit show?
The knife indicated as K3.
And does that exhibit fairly and accurately depict knife K3 as you saw it at the evidence lab?
It does.
Your Honor, I move to admit Defendant Officer Perez's Exhibit E8.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
No objection.
E8 will be admitted.
Now, is that the picture I just handed you?
It is.
Now, I'm also going to, now, in this picture, this knife has the same blade as the other knife, correct?
Correct.
Same serrated blade.
Correct.
Same little knob on it, correct?
Correct.
And same black handle.
Correct.
I'm going to show you what's been previously admitted as Defendant Officer Perez's Exhibit E4. You'll notice that it's just the other side of K3.
Correct.
Does that also appear to be the same as K2?
It does.
So it's the same knife as K2?
The same type of knife, yes.
Okay. And those were both knives based on your investigation that James Boyd was holding at the time he was shot, correct?
Correct.
Now, you also talked about Officer Perez's video, the video that was recovered from his helmet camera, correct?
Correct.
And that video was recovered when Officer Dominic Perez was processed for evidence after this shooting, correct?
Correct.
And Officer Perez was processed in the crime van that was located in front of 1812 Piedra Vista, correct?
812.
812, I'm sorry.
Correct.
And he was processed at approximately 9:04 p.m., correct?
Correct.
And based on your investigation in this case, you learned that the shooting, the actual shooting of Mr. Boyd, occurred at roughly 7:30, correct?
Correct.
So approximately 90 minutes passed from the time of the shooting until Officer Perez was processed for evidence, correct?
Correct.
When Officer Perez was processed, an SD card from his Contour Rome helmet camera was collected into evidence.
Yes.
And what is an SD card?
It's a small memory chip.
Okay. So it's just a chip from the camera,
Correct.
and it contains the contents of what was captured on the camera, correct?
Correct.
And you had a chance to view that video.
Correct.
Is it fair to say that his video lasted approximately 3 minutes and 39 seconds?
Sounds about right.
And it's also fair to say that the video captured on Officer Perez's helmet camera captured the moments before the shooting, correct?
Correct.
The shooting itself,
Correct.
and the moments following the shooting.
Correct.
Now, as you understand the charges brought by the state in this case, Officer Perez's video captures what the state contends was James Boyd's murder, correct?
Correct.
Now, despite the fact, well, despite the fact that the video you collected and Officer Perez willingly gave to you captures what the state contends was his act of murdering Mr. James Boyd. He willingly gave you that SD card, correct?
Correct.
And you didn't notice any kind of tampering with that SD card, correct?
I did not know.
And he gave you that SD card 90 minutes after the shooting occurred, correct?
Correct.
And throughout your entire investigation in this case, has that Officer Perez done anything to hamper your investigation?
No.
To disrupt your investigation?
No.
To bias your investigation?
No.
Now, there was also evidence collected from the scene which was indicative of the use of a taser, correct?
The taser shotgun.
Okay. And you mentioned that an X-Rep hole was collected, correct?
Correct.
And that's essentially what contains the taser probes that are shot out of the gun, correct?
Correct.
Now, one X-Rep probe, the probe itself, not the hole, it was located at the scene, correct?
Correct.
And another X-Rep probe was collected from Mr. Boyd's belongings that were received at the office of the medical investigator, correct?
Correct.
Now, I'd like to first talk to you about the X-Rep probe that was located at the scene. Using Defendant Officer Perez's Exhibit N, can you please identify the location of the X-Rep probe that was located at the scene?
I believe it was P1.
Okay. Now, are you sure it was P1?
I'm not.
Would it help refresh your recollection if you were able to look at your report?
Yes, it would.
And after you've, if you're able to refresh your recollection, please let me know and then I'll take the report back. Did that help refresh your recollection as to what the taser probe at the scene was marked, how it was marked?
It was marked as P1.
Okay. Now, so if you could, oh, you've already done it, so you marked P1. Was that also photographed?
It was.
Going to hand you what's been marked as Defendant Officer Perez's Exhibit E16 for identification purposes. And what have I just handed you?
It's a photograph of the X-Rep.
And does that fairly and accurately represent the X-Rep as it was when it was located at the scene?
It does.
Your Honor, I move to admit Defendant Officer Perez's Exhibit E16 into evidence. Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Mr. Bergman, any objection to that? It will be admitted.
Now you'll be able to see it on the screen next to you. Can you please indicate in this photograph where the actual probe is located?
Oh, there's two pieces. There's the actual barbs themselves and then the base.
Okay. And it looks like there are wires in this photograph, correct?
Correct.
And do those wires connect what you've indicated as the probe and the base?
They do.
Now, did you discover any evidence in this case that that probe that was marked as P1 actually came into contact with Mr. Boyd?
There's speculation, Your Honor.
Response?
If you know,
Okay, thank you, counsel.
if you know, did you, well, based on your observations in your investigation, did you uncover any evidence that this probe marked as P1 came into contact with Mr. Boyd?
Not specifically.
Now, you also located an X-ret probe was located at the hospital, correct?
It was collected with his clothing, yes.
Okay. And the fact that it was collected with his clothing indicates that it was connected to Mr. Boyd at the time he was transported to the hospital, correct?
Correct.
Now, I'd like to briefly talk to you about the clothing Mr. Boyd was wearing and that was collected in this case. Now, during your investigation in this case, you collected the clothes Mr. Boyd was wearing, correct?
They were collected from the hospital by crime scene specialist, I believe it was Miller,
Okay.
who brought them to the scene.
Okay, so crime scene specialist Miller collected them from the hospital and brought them to the scene, correct?
Correct.
And I'd like to talk to you about the various clothes Mr. Boyd was wearing at the time he was shot. So on his torso, Mr. Boyd was wearing a white t-shirt, correct?
Correct.
A gray long sleeve t-shirt, correct?
Correct.
A black V-neck t-shirt, correct?
I believe so.
A gray and red long sleeve t-shirt, correct?
Correct.
And a gray hooded sweatshirt.
Correct.
Now, each one of those pieces of clothing had indications that they'd been cut off his body, correct?
Correct.
Which is indicative of the fact that they were on him at the time he was shot, correct?
Correct.
So at the time Mr. Boyd was shot, he was wearing 4 shirts and 1 sweatshirt, correct?
Correct.
Now, on March 16th, it was not an abnormally cold day, as you recall, correct?
Not that I recall.
In fact, it was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit that night when you arrived at the crime scene.
Correct.
Now, in regard to the items of clothing Mr. Boyd was wearing on his lower body, he was wearing a pair of black slacks, correct?
Correct.
A pair of black and gray athletic pants, correct?
Correct.
Silver athletic shorts,
Correct.
and gray athletic shorts.
Correct.
So Mr. Boyd had 4 layers of clothing on his lower body, correct?
Correct.
And he had all that clothing on despite the fact that it was a relatively warm night in March, correct?
I don't know about warm, but
50 degrees?
yes.
Okay. I have no further questions, Your Honor. I pass the witness.
All right, sir. Redirect, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. One moment, Your Honor. Detective Render, handing you what's been previously admitted as 19B1, and that's been admitted as one of the knives collected at the scene that we just saw a lot of pictures of. And that knife there, if you could please pick it up, please. And turn it over like you'd be holding it in your right hand. Get it close there. With it held in your right hand, is that metal knob close to your right thumb?
It is.
And is that what you would push to open it with your right hand?
Correct.
What about 19B2? Holding that in your right hand, is that metal knob where you would need to push it to open it with your right hand?
Yes.
Now, you've already testified that the purpose of those knobs is to assist a person opening it with one hand, right?
Correct.
Can you put that knife in your left hand, like you'd be trying to open it? Can your left thumb touch that knob on that knife recovered from the scene that day?
No, it cannot.
Can you use that knob to open that knife with one hand?
Possible.
Can you use your thumb? on
Not
your
the
left
thumb,
hand?
no.
How about the other knife? Can you please put your the other knife in your left hand? Does your left hand's thumb touch that knob used to open that knife with one hand?
No.
If the purpose of that knob is to allow you to open the knife with your thumb on one hand, would not being able to reach it with your thumb on the other hand make it more difficult to open that knife?
Yes.
You talked about the SD card being collected from Officer Pettis' helmet cam. Are officers required by the Albuquerque Police Department in a use of force incident to turn over the cards from their cameras?
Yes.
Are they required to do that under the rules, even if they've done wrong?
Yes.
You ever go camping?
It's been a while.
Objection beyond the scope, whether or not this witness has ever gone camping.
I'm not sure where the question's going. I'll allow this question, but go ahead and ask your next question.
When you've gone camping or been camping with other people, have you ever heard the term dressing in layers?
Yes.
What's the purpose of dressing in layers when camping?
In case you need to take some off to cool down or put more on to warm up.
So is it fair to say that a person camping, or you when camping, put on multiple layers to stay warm?
Objection,
when camping?
meeting.
Rephrase the question, please.
What's the purpose of wearing multiple layers when camping?
Objection, asked and answered. That's an objection, asked and answered, I'm sorry.
I'll allow the question be asked.
What's the purpose of wearing multiple layers of clothing when camping?
In case you get too warm, you can take some off. And if you need to warm up, put more on.
When you arrived on the scene, you testified that it was 50 degrees.
I believe so.
That night, did it ever get colder than 50 degrees?
It did.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
I just had one question for you, Detective. You had mentioned earlier in your testimony that you didn't get Officer Ingram's lapel camera until 10 days later. My question is, when did you request, or did you request his lapel camera at the time of the incident?
I don't believe so. I believe it may have been missed that he had one with him.
When did you request it?
Within a day or two of getting it.
So when you said you got it 10 days later, would it be fair to say that you requested it either the 8th or 9th day prior to that 10-day period?
Correct.
I see. All right, thank you. May this witness be excused by the state?
Maybe just one follow-up based on the court's line of
On
questioning.
what I asked, go ahead.
Are all officers of the Albuquerque Police Department told that they're supposed to hand over their lapel cameras or the SD cards in a use of force incident when they're being processed?
Objection calls for speculation.
I'll allow the question if he knows if there's a policy or a procedure concerning that.
I don't know about a policy, but it's practice that when they do come in, we ask for cameras, taser cameras or SD cards.
Does the defense have any questions based on what I asked?
And let me just follow up on that last point, and you're the one that asked them to give you the SD card, right?
I personally did not.
I know you personally don't, but the crime lab detective is the one that is requesting those from the officers, right?
Correct.
Anything else? All right, thank you. May step down. May he be excused from the case.
You may, Your Honor. Thank you.
Defense?
Yes.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you very much. Counsel, we're getting close to the 10 o'clock hour. I'll go ahead and take my recess now, and we'll continue. We'll be in recess till about 10 after 10.
All rise.